Fun fact, of the 20-odd mass murderers that you're about to meet, who are all doing a whole life order, the only two women included are the two most prolific murderers. Enjoy. Rose West was born in 1953 in North Devon. Between 1973 and 1987, alongside her husband, she tortured, raped and murdered all of 10 young women. On her own, in 1971, she murdered the stepdaughter of Fred West. By that point, she and Fred had got married and Fred was in prison. She told him what she'd done and he didn't care. They used to get these young women to come into their home. They lived in this really big home in Cromwell Street in Gloucester in southwest England, and then they would lead them down to a cellar that Fred had purpose built for the mission of torturing and murdering these young women, and that is what the two of them did. They would both essay and grape them over a number of days. They would hang them upside down before eventually killing them. They had several children, 7 in total, and in fact of the 7 children, 3 were fathered by punters that Rose had in her work as a prostitute. That's something she started doing after she had her second child, and she really loved it. She used to advertise, she used to go out and into the West Indian community and get black guys to come and shag her for money. Rose and Fred were in the habit of essaying their own children. In 1987, one of their children, who was 16 at the time, Heather West, was standing up to Fred saying, "No, leave me alone, I don't want you to do the thing to me." So they dragged her down to the cellar and murdered her, and it was on Rose's instigation. Fred West killed himself in prison. Rose, meanwhile, has been banged up since 1995 under a whole life order. As at the time of this recording, Rose West is on her last legs. She's getting end of life care, so she'll soon be no more. And that's the story of Rose West. Now viewer, if I've got you hooked on the video so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. Dale Cregan's murder of 2 women police officers in 2012 was as vile and shocking as it was gratuitous. Fiona Bone, 32, and Nicola Hughes, 23, were out on a routine patrol on the 18th of September 2012 when they were sent to Abbey Gardens in Hattersley, Tameside in Greater Manchester. This was at about 11 a.m. and it was in response to a report of criminal damage. Someone had phoned up and said that some random person had thrown a pavement slab through their window. The person who made that call was well-known gangster Dale Cregan, only the person taking the call didn't know that at the time. When Miss Bone and Miss Hughes turned up to Cregan's home, he opened fire on them, he shot at them, he threw a grenade at them. Fiona Bone died at the scene while Nicola Hughes was badly wounded and died later in hospital. And Dale Cregan's reason for doing that was that he was fed up with the police constantly constantly questioning him and members of his family, going around to their home, all in investigation of a murder. I think it was about 2 murders actually that Cregan had recently carried out. That was literally Cregan's reason for taking the lives of these 2 women. In addition, having also been convicted of the 2 murders for which he was being investigated at the time when he murdered the 2 police women, Dale Cregan is officially a quadruple murderer. Cregan got his whole life order in June 2013. Stephen Port, who was born in 1975, is not only a serial killer but also a serial rapist. Between 2014 and 2015, Paul murdered 4 young men that he met online. He'd get them to come over to his flat over in Barking in East London, and there he would drug them with GHB, gamma hydroxybutyric acid, quite a well-known date rape drug, and then of course rape them. And all 4 victims died from an overdose of the drug. In the case of one victim, Paul inserted the drug, or rather injected it, directly into the man's you-know-what hole.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Klein?
No, I didn't know that.
So, were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone. that's down at the party you buy.
Might help if I show you a picture. We'll call this CRT 2. This is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that, mate?
No. No, I just don't recognise him. I don't pay full attention to the guy's faces when I have paid attention to the parties. But I don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know. No.
And I mean, that's Jack Taylor, so you don't recognise
No, I don't.
Jack Taylor?
No.
Paul got his whole life order in 2016. To this day, though, apparently he denies any of the murders. For murdering 7 newborn babies and attempting to murder a further 8, former neonatal nurse Lucy Letby is doing a record 15 whole life prison sentences. Everyone always talks about how normal Lucy Letby seemed to everyone. She had a good circle of friends, a great social life, went on holidays with her colleagues at work. People liked her well enough. She had a bit of a fling with a married doctor. She worked at the Countess of Chester Hospital and she murdered babies and attempted to murder them by injecting insulin and air into their bloodstream. Lucy Letby's murder trial lasted nearly a year. It finished in summer 2023 and Letby got 14 whole life orders. The following year, she got her 15th whole life order following a retrial of one of the murder charges, or it was either a murder charge or a charge of attempted murder. Either way, she was convicted. There are lots of people who say that Lucy Letby is a scapegoat. The deaths of those newborn babies, who I think were all premature, were due to clinical errors of other people. She keeps appealing. Her story, I think, will continue to unravel for many years to come. For 70s career criminal John Childs, killing people for pay was a great little earner. He murdered 6 people, he was paid to do so, and he did those murders between 1974 and 1978. Childs murdered Terence Eve in 1974, Robert Brown in 1975, George Brett and his 10-year-old son Terry Brett later on in 1975, Fred Sherwood in 1978, and Ronald Andrews later on in 1978. The man was jailed in December 1979, with the murders being committed by shooting and stabbing. Damien Bendall committed his horrendous acts under the influence of drugs. He murdered, first of all, his girlfriend, who was pregnant with his child. Then he murdered her 2 young children, and then he murdered the school friend of one of the children who was staying over. This all took place in the Derbyshire town of Killamarsh in September 2021. He also confessed to the rape of one of the children, a little girl. Bendall got his whole life order in 2022. John William Cooper, who was born in 1944, is also known as the Bullseye killer, and he's a Welsh serial killer. On the 26th of May 2011, he was given a whole life order for the 1985 double murder of siblings Richard and Helen Thomas, and for the 1989 double murder of Peter and Gwenda Dixon. The murders were known in the media as the Pembrokeshire murders or the coastal murders, because that's where the murders took place, and because of those murders, tourism in that area dropped dramatically. Cooper was also sentenced for the rape of a 16-year-old girl and a sexual assault on a 15-year-old girl, both of those attacks having been carried out while a group of 5 teenagers were held at gunpoint in March 1996 in a wooded area behind the Mount Estate in Cooper's hometown of Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire. Now we've got the joint case of Kenneth Regan and William Horncy. In 2003 in London, 5 members of an Indian family were kidnapped and murdered by a criminal gang. The millionaire businessman Amarjit Chauhan disappeared along with his wife, his 2 baby sons and his mother-in-law. The bodies were initially buried in Devon before they were later dumped in the sea off Poole in Dorset, where 3 of them were eventually discovered in the English Channel. The bodies of the 2 little boys were never found. Kenneth Regan and William Horncy were given whole life orders for the 5 murders. Peter Rees was convicted of one of the murders. The motive was financial, as they planned to take over Amarjit Chauhan's freight company, which they then wanted to use as a front for importing drugs. The case was highly publicised due to the sheer brutality of the crime, and the trial was the longest in the history of the Metropolitan Police. Mark Richard Hobson, who was born on the 2nd of September 1969, killed 4 people in North Yorkshire in July 2004. His first murder was that of his very girlfriend, Claire Sanderson, and he killed her at their home, which was near Selby. After that, he lured Claire's twin sister, Diane, to the home and then murdered her several days later. Afterwards, he fled the property and murdered an elderly couple who lived several miles away before going on the run. He was arrested soon after, 8 days after I think, when he was spotted hiding in bushes near a petrol station in North Yorkshire. A bin man who had a history of violence, drug addiction and alcoholism, Hobson pleaded guilty to all the charges against him in April 2005 and got his whole life prison sentence. His subsequent appeal for a lower tariff failed. When Rashan Arshad murdered his wife and their 3 children in a so-called honour killing, he felt, quote, totally justified in what he did, unquote. That quotation comes from the police who were involved in the case. A 36-year-old taxi driver, Arshad beat his wife and 3 children to death with a rounder's bat at their home in Cheadle-Hulme, Manchester in July 2006. This then is how Uzma Rayhan, 32, Adam, 11, Abbas, 8 and Henna, 6 all lost their lives. According to investigating officers, Arshad felt his wife had brought the killing on herself by having an affair. This adulterous behaviour of Uzma's shamed the whole family, meaning that they all had to die, except the husband. He got his whole life order in 2007. In the early hours of the 7th of August 1985, near the village of Tollishunt Darcy in Essex, southeast England, Neville and Jean Bamber, both 61, their adopted daughter Sheila Caffell, 28, and Sheila's 6-year-old twin sons Daniel and Nicholas Caffell were all shot dead in their home, White House Farm. The only member of the immediate family to survive the night was the adopted son, Jeremy Bamber, who was then aged 24 and who, luckily for him, had been at his own home in the nearby village of Goldfinger when the mass murder took place. The police were first alerted to a disturbance at White House Farm when, at 3 a.m. on the 7th of August, Jeremy himself called them, claiming to have just received a distressing call from his father, telling him that his sister had gone berserk and that she had a gun.
My father's phoned from White House Farm and he sounded really frightened. He says, my sister's gone crazy and she's got a gun.
Jeremy added that after he himself heard a shot being fired, the line had gone dead. In his call to the police, Jeremy referred to his sister as a nutter. This was a reference to the lady's recent diagnosis of schizophrenia. Initially, the police wrote this devastating set of murders up as murder-suicide. When they went to investigate, you see, they found the body of Sheila Caffell with blood oozing from her throat and with the semi-automatic rifle belonging to Neville, with which all the murders had been perpetrated, lying so as to be pointing towards Sheila's throat. One of Jeremy's cousins, however, whose name is Anne Eaton, discovered 3 days after the killings that the silencer to the murder weapon was in a cupboard in the home instead of being on the rifle, which is where it had always been kept. It seemed very unlikely to Anne and to other members of the family that Sheila would have murdered everyone with the silencer on the rifle and then thoughtfully gone and put the silencer away before shooting herself. They also estimated that keeping the silencer on the rifle would have made the rifle too long for Sheila to reach the trigger in order to shoot herself in the face. It also emerged that Sheila had not one bullet wound to the face, but two, which, as you can see, makes it even less likely that she shot herself. It's also hard to believe, I'd say, that instead of calling the police or trying to save either his family or himself when his daughter started shooting everyone, Neville Bamber chose to call his son instead. How could he have done any such thing with bullet after bullet flying around his head, for instance? Jeremy Bamber murdered his entire immediate family for the substantial inheritance that he stood to gain after doing so. Straight after the funerals, which took place a few days after the killings, the young man not only went on a windsurfing holiday with his girlfriend, Julie Mugford, but also did lots and lots of partying besides that. That doesn't sound like grief or sadness to me. It was Julie's very report to the police, some weeks later, when she and Jeremy had split up, of Jeremy's year-long plan to do away with his whole family and frame his sister that triggered a renewed police probe into the massacre, which led, in October 1986, to Jeremy's conviction for the killings and to the whole life prison sentence for the perpetrator that came with that. The case of Mark Martin from 2005 feels to me like something of a premonition of the atrocities of Valdo Calocane, and you should look that guy up if you're not familiar with his horrendous acts. In 2005, Mark Martin killed 3 homeless women in Nottingham, and he killed them between December 2004 and January 2005. He said that his motive for the murders was to become, quote, Nottingham's first serial killer, unquote. He had 2 accomplices and they were also convicted, but whereas Martin got a whole life prison order, his accomplices received prison terms of 14 and 25 years respectively. Of the 4 murders that Robert Maudsley, who was born in June 1953 in Liverpool, committed between 1974 and 1978, 3 were committed while he was in criminal custody. One of no fewer than 12 children, Maudsley found himself, at the age of 8, being returned to the care of his parents after having been taken away from them, along with some of his siblings, at the age of 21 months due to serious parental neglect. He was returned to the care of social services at 16, however, after suffering years of the most horrific violence and essay from his lorry driver father, who was often put up to his abusive behaviour towards his son by none other than his wife, Maudsley's own mother. Having developed severe psychological trauma, as attested by his numerous attempts at suicide, and having become a substance abuser, at 20, Maudsley was supporting himself down in London by working as a prostitute. He garroted a client of his, John Farrell, over in Wood Green, North London, in March 1974, after the man showed him pictures of his child SA victims. After handing himself into the police, Maudsley was sent to Broadmoor Hospital, a psychiatric unit, having been deemed unfit to stand trial. Nothing much came of the man's act from 1976 of holding a fellow patient hostage. That wasn't the case, however, when he murdered another fellow patient by the name of David Francis, who happened to be a child SE ex-offender. Having carried out Francis's torture and murder alongside David Cheeseman, another patient, Maudsley claimed that his reason for ramming a sharpened spoon into his deceased victim's ear with such force that it penetrated through to the man's brain and then splitting the man's head open, exposing his very brain, was to enable him to literally feed on the man's brain. Even though the perpetrator was proven ultimately not to have cannibalised his victim in any way, the media dubbing of Hannibal the Cannibal that this claim of his earned him has stuck with him even up to now. Maudsley was tried for and convicted of Francis's murder, sent to Wakefield's maximum security prison in West Yorkshire, planned on the 29th of July 1978 to murder 7 of his fellow inmates, succeeded in murdering 2, got a whole life prison order, got moved into an underground cage built specifically for him, and in 2000 had his request for a pet budgie denied. When, in April 2025, the man was moved to HMP Whitemoor in Cambridgeshire, he had spent all of 42 years in solitary confinement, with, moreover, the 51 years that he served, as at the time of this recording. He's the UK's longest serving prisoner and apparently has no desire to be released. Well, when you're bound by your sentence to be locked up until you die, that's quite handy, I'd say. Steve Wright, who was born in 1958, is known in the media as the Suffolk Strangler, the man behind the Ipswich serial killings of late 2006. Between the 30th of October and the 10th of December 2006, the bodies of 5 women, who all happened to be sex workers, were discovered at different locations near Ipswich in Suffolk, England. While their bodies were discovered naked, there were no signs of SA. 2 of the victims, Annalie Alderton and Paula Clennell, were confirmed to have been killed by strangling. The cause of death of the other 3 victims, Gemma Adams, Tanya Nicol and Annette Nichols, was never established, the perpetrator himself staying silent on the matter. Similarly, the man has never said why he killed the 5 women. Was it due to resentment of and disgust for women who sell sex, like the case of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper? Who knows? What is known, though, is that Wright himself was a long-standing user of sex workers. Wright got his whole life order in 2008. Peter Moore was born in 1946 and he used to manage cinemas in North Wales. That was when he wasn't committing any of the 4 murders for which he is now rotting in prison under a whole life prison order. Before he took to murder, the man committed no fewer than 39 sex attacks on men in North Wales and in Merseyside over a 20-year period. He committed his 4 murders between September and December 1995. He stabbed his victims and then mutilated them. At trial, he told the jury that the crimes were committed by a fictitious homosexual lover that he nicknamed Jason after the killer in the Friday the 13th horror films. The jury, of course, found him guilty on all 4 counts of murder. In March 2011, Moore challenged his whole life prison sentence in the European Court of Human Rights, and he aimed, in fact, to have the whole life order outlawed throughout Europe. However, he failed. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.